It's a very simple story. Prayer is simple, a simple thing to be in God's presence, to share God's love, to bring our concerns and joys to God. It seems like a simple thing, but we know that prayer can get complicated because we're people engaging in prayer, learning to engage in prayer, to be with God, to be with each other in God's presence. It gets complicated for that reason. And parables, these little stories that Jesus tells throughout the Gospels, are also simple stories. They're stories that at least appear to be very simple on the surface. Oftentimes there's stories about farming. You know, if you plant seeds in a pile of stones or in a patch of thorn bushes, they're not going to grow very well. If you plant them in some nicely cultivated, healthy soil, they'll grow. So, simple story and an easy point. But parables can kind of unravel themselves in our hands as we work with them. They ask us different questions sometimes. You know, am I the one planting the seeds? Spreading the seeds everywhere I can, trusting in God that some of them are going to grow? Am I the seed, hoping that I'm in the right place, that I can have sun and water and grow? We take them personally in different ways. And a simple story can take us in 1,000 different directions, depending on where we are and who we are. This particular story, in Luke's gospel, Luke takes care to make it very simple. It has a very clear ending when Jesus says, "If you exalt yourself, you will be humbled. If you humble yourself, you will be exalted." That's the point. But the wonderful and the kind of dangerous thing about parables, even this one, is the way that they do unravel as we dig deeper down into the simple core of the message. A parable might challenge us to hear something or see something brand new, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of living or being that we never thought of, that's challenging. Or oftentimes, parables may call us back to something old, a deep, wise memory that we share, knowledge in our gut that God's love and mercy cannot be limited. It's much bigger than we can fathom, and challenges us to see ourselves and others through these eyes of God's mercy. The Apostle Paul, in one of his letters, described Jesus and his message as a stone that people stumble over. A theologian, Paul Tillich, used to say that the danger is that we'll stumble over the wrong thing. Russell Rathbun calls this, in relationship to the parables, a trap. The parable trap. And I think parables are designed to confuse us a little bit. What I mean is this. Here's our story, Luke chapter 18. Two people come to pray. It starts out very clearly. It tells us what the story is about before we even hear the story. Jesus told this parable, verse 9, to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and looked at others with contempt. Okay, I get it. It's that Pharisee, that self-righteous jerk. Well, I thank God that I'm not a holier-than-thou religious snob like that Pharisee in that story. Oops. That's the parable trap. It pulls us in very quickly. We get the point. But as soon as we get that message about being self-righteous and smug, we find ourselves maybe being self-righteous and smug. So let's let's think together about this story, and if there's ways to tell the story so that we don't get sucked into the trap, or so we notice when we do, and maybe see what Jesus was up to. I remember real clearly riding to church in the backseat of my parents' car, 7 or 8 years old. And I remember one Sunday in particular. It was a sunny day and the grass was growing, and I saw some neighbors mowing their yard. And we were on our way to church. And I thought to myself, you know what? We mowed our yard yesterday, so we would be ready to go to church this morning. Yeah. Then I remember this, there was a lady jogging down the street. And I thought, boy, jogging on Sunday morning. I don't know where I got this as a 7-year-old kid, but I felt pretty good that we were going to church and not mowing our grass or jogging or doing something else on Sunday. It's a natural thing. And it makes me notice when I tell stories like this that kids are pretty quick to pick up our prejudice. And so when I talk to children about God and about faith, what I really hope and pray for is that I don't pass on something that confuses or gets in the way of God's love. That's what I want to do when I tell particularly Bible stories to children. And with that, thinking about that, in this parable, we should also take a look at the other side of the potential trap in this parable. We not only have our self-righteousness to work with, but we also have maybe self-loathing or a sense of false humility that might say or communicate, just keep your head down, be quiet, don't expect much. Remember, you're not really that important. That's not the message of this parable when Jesus speaks of humility. We're not better than anyone else, but we don't need to imagine that we're not important to God either. I think what I want to communicate through this story to children and to myself, to take deeply into my own heart, is that we can be kind and loving to ourselves and to others because God is kind and loving to us. And in our praying and our worship of God, we can hold each other and ourselves in God's presence, knowing that we're all in need of God's mercy, and God does not refuse us. So prayer is pretty simple, I think. Here in Luke 18, Jesus actually tells two parables back to back. The one we've just heard follows another short story about a widow, a woman who comes in front of a judge day after day. She comes to this judge and she stands in line and she waits to bring her case before this judge. She's asking for justice because someone has treated her wrongly. And day after day, the judge just doesn't care. He sees her coming and, he rolls his eyes, and here she comes again. And he says, "Lady, sorry. You're wasting my time. You're wasting everybody else's time. Take off." But every day she keeps coming back. He tells her that she's wasting valuable time, but day after day, she comes because she knows that she is a child of God and that she is able to come and bring her request and to receive justice and mercy. So finally, the judge sees her coming on one particular day and is so tired of her, says, "Okay, you win. You win. You can have it." And the judge makes the judgment so that justice can be done with the person who has done her wrong. Because she stood up for herself. She was a child of God, and she knew it. The parable about the Pharisee and the tax man warns us against thinking we're better than others and therefore more loved by God. But the parable about the widow who stood up for herself warns against the opposite problem, thinking that we're not as good as others and therefore probably not much loved by God. With this parable of the two prayers, Jesus challenges us to see that we can't put limits on God's love and mercy. What comes out in this story, and probably what jumped out for Jesus' disciples and his other listeners, people in his audience, was that the tax collector came to the temple and received God's mercy. And that is the thing in this story, I imagine, that really bothered them, the disciples and others, that this tax collector is receiving God's mercy. I think we should remember that even though a lot of us, I think, if we've been listening to parables for a long time in our lives, we've probably kind of internalized the idea that Pharisees were bad guys and that we should be suspicious of them when they show up in these stories. But it's important to note that the Pharisee is the one that Jesus and his disciples and the rest of his listeners would have identified with most. They would have been rooting for the Pharisee in this story until the surprise comes. A tax collector shows up and is the one who receives God's mercy. Of course, the Pharisee is better than the tax collector to the people who heard this story for the first time. Jewish New Testament scholar Amy Levin says that the tax collector would have been seen as corrupt, a traitor to his people, overcharging them probably for his own gain, and worse than that, working for the Roman Empire, who used the temple as its own personal bank. But even Jesus' disciples and the rest of his mostly Jewish audience, who generally respected Pharisees, would have seen the Pharisee in this story. This Pharisee was kind of a caricature. Levine says that Jesus' portrait here of this Pharisee might have made the real Pharisees in the audience chuckle a little bit. Because he didn't simply just do what was required of him, as he outlines all of the righteous stuff that he did. He tithed on all of his income. He fasted twice a week. That wasn't necessary. That was way beyond what was required of him. And Jesus' listeners knew that. Everything he said about himself was true. He was a good guy. I mean, he was almost a saint. He was practicing his faith as the law required and as he understood it. The problem with this Pharisee is not the things he did, it's not what he said about himself, but it's how he says it. And it's how he uses it, his religion, as a weapon against the tax collector and to prop himself up. That's not hard to do, to want to prop myself up, even with my faith or with other things that I just feel right about. In our digital age, we might call this virtue signaling. You know, it's when I make sure to sign all the right petitions online and to like all the right issues and to forward the right memes. It does make me feel good and right, and there's nothing wrong with any of that, with sharing what I believe in and what I think is important and right. And I do get rewarded for it, usually, because most people in my online communities agree with me, and they want to say the same things, and I feel good. And I might feel good when I can point to other people who don't get it, who don't care. And I can thank God that I'm not like them and prop myself up. It's just the trap of this parable. It's just the same thing. The Pharisee was a good guy, but he must have felt a need to dehumanize or to shame the tax collector in order to get God's loving gaze to fall on him. But God isn't like that. I think that's why Jesus tells the story. Maybe Jesus wants those hearing this story, all of us, to know we're loved by God, whether we come in the tax collector's shoes or the Pharisees. If we keep walking through Luke chapter 18, we find out that as soon as Jesus gets done saying the last line, if you exalt yourself, you will be humbled. But if you humble yourself, you will be exalted. As soon as Jesus says that, immediately, his friends and disciples turn around and scold some children and their parents for wasting Jesus' valuable time. And theirs, too. Jesus is busy teaching us. He has important things to do, and you kids and your parents don't understand this. Jesus doesn't have time for you. And Jesus very quickly makes them understand that their friendship with him doesn't make anyone else less important. Let the children come to me, Jesus says, and learn from them how it's done. The disciples were not more important to Jesus like the Pharisee, even though he was a good man. His goodness didn't make him more loved by God than the tax man. The parable of the two prayers challenges us to think about our posture when we come to pray. It's an opportunity maybe to think, what is prayer for? What is worship about? What is my posture when I come before God? Literally, I think the story shows us that in prayer and worship, that I don't need to cling to myself, my goodness, my rights, my accomplishments, proving my relationship with God, that I'm worthy of God. And I don't need to block or to shame others or to protect myself or my faith against them in fear or in competition. But like in children's time, we can hold open hands before God, bringing ourselves and others into God's light and love, holding this moment together as a gift to all of us, sharing the experience and the reality of loving God and being loved by God. The kingdom is here and everywhere. God's love is here and everywhere. Forgiveness is a reality here and everywhere. Mercy is here and everywhere. This is the message of Jesus' parables over and over again. The dream of God is coming alive among us. Look for it. Not just for those good enough to earn it, whatever that means, or smart enough to understand it, or even kind enough to share it, but for all who want to receive it. Maybe this is what Jesus would have wished for the Pharisee in the story, that he could celebrate and honor the fact that that tax collector came to the temple to pray. That tax collector is on a journey with God. He made a step toward God, coming to the temple and asking for mercy, coming to receive it like a little child. Maybe the Pharisee needed to receive mercy too, holding himself and his brother in the open space of God's infinite mercy. And may we also know God's love and mercy alive within us and among us. Amen.